Hello and welcome to my world. Today I'm going to be showing you some details about my six-wheel drive Tamiya bullhead truck that I call Chernobog. And before I get started on this truck, let me tell you a little bit about why I chose to build this truck in the first place. And if you saw my video about my Tamiya bullhead that I call Raging Bull, you know that I have had a lifelong obsession with monster semi-trucks. And ever since I was a kid, I've always loved gigantic monster trucks that are based on semi-trucks. And when I was a kid, I had a Stomper truck. Remember those little battery-powered Stomper trucks? And I had one that was a six-wheel drive semi-truck that was powered by two AA batteries. So I had that when I was really little, and I have always had an obsession with not only monster semi-trucks, but also six-wheel drive monster trucks. So there also were a few six-wheel drive monster trucks that were out back in the 1980s that I really loved. One of them was called Brutus, which was a six-wheel drive Chevy pickup truck monster. And another one was called Six-Foot, which was a 6x6 Ford monster truck. And those two were based on pickup trucks. But the one truck that absolutely just blew my mind from the first time I saw it in photos was a blue Peterbilt monster semi-truck called King of the Road that was built by Don Buchholz. And I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. But it was a humongous Peterbilt semi-truck that had 66-inch tall tires on it, and it was fully functioning six-wheel drive, and it just absolutely blew my mind. And the truck recently was completely restored, so it's still operating to this day, and I'll leave a link to a video of King of the Road in the description below. So I've always had an obsession with not only monster semi-trucks, but also 6x6 monster trucks. And so hence, that's why I decided to build this truck, which I call Chernobog. Now, how the truck got the name Chernobog also is a little interesting story. And if you did not know, I am also a huge Disney animated film fan. And my favorite Disney animated film is Fantasia. And in that film, towards the end, there is a segment based on the classical musical piece called Night on Bald Mountain. And in that segment, there is this huge demon that rises above a mountain. He comes out of a mountain and raises the spirits of the dead from a cemetery at the base of the mountain. And yes, believe it or not, that somewhat scary story is the plot of a Disney film, or part of a Disney film. So if you haven't seen Fantasia, check it out and take a look at the A Night on Bald Mountain segment in that film towards the end, and you'll see that huge demon, and his name is Chernobog. And I've always liked that demon, and it was like the perfect name for a gigantic monster truck. So hence the name for this truck I called Chernobog. So now I'll talk a little bit about the details of this truck. The body on top is a Tamiya bullhead body, and I did not know what to do with this truck when I first got it, or I first started putting it together. I didn't know there were other 6x6 monster trucks based on Tamiya bullheads that I had seen before, and people put like stake beds on the back and put on like gigantic dump truck beds on the back. And I didn't know what to do with this truck when I first started working on it. So I left the bullhead body basically stock and unpainted for quite a while, at least a good 6 or 8 months, while I was deciding what to do with it. And I didn't know if I was gonna turn it into a true big rig. I even considered putting a trailer on the back of it and making it into a semi-truck. And after 6 or 8 months, I just couldn't decide what to do. So I said, oh, let me just paint the body, finish it, and just stick it on here, and then I can always decide what to do later on. So That was over 20 years ago, and it still has pretty much the stock bullhead body on it to this day. So I may change it. Who knows? That's been a long time project in the back of my mind for many decades now. But as it appears now, it still has the roll bar on the back with the fuel tanks, and it basically is a stock bullhead body. That the only modifications I made to fit it on this chassis were I cut off the back wall of the bullhead body right here. Normally that extends downward to cover up the back of the stock bullhead frame. And also I just cut a little bit out of the fuel tanks right here to fit around the sides of the chassis right here. But that's it. Aside from that, it's a bone stock bullhead body. And I am a terrible body painter, so I had this body painted by a member of the old RCMT monster truck message board back in the day, and that member's nickname was Hot Rodical Customs, and he had a side business of painting styrene Tamiya truck bodies, and he used real automotive paint. And when I sent it to him, I basically just said something red with flames. And this is what he did. He painted it with real automotive paint, and I was absolutely blown away by the paint job he did. It's incredibly high quality. The flames are nice and crisp, and I love how the flames start out in silver and then they slowly fade to purple. And another thing I absolutely love is underneath, he actually painted flames in the fender wells under there. So you can actually see flames painted in the fenders, and that was just blew my mind when he did that. So it also has several coats of clear on top of that paint job. So he did an absolutely fantastic job, and unfortunately he is no longer painting bodies. Otherwise I would have sent the body for Raging Bull to him to be painted, but he no longer paints bodies. So I am so glad that he painted this body for me, and he did such a fantastic job on it. The backbone of this truck is a Sassy Chassis SST 6-wheel drive chassis, and there actually were two different versions of Sassy Chassis, the company. The original Sassy Chassis was started, I think, around the late 1980s, and it lasted for a few years and then went out of business and kind of disappeared. And then sometime, I want to say in the mid to late 90s, the Sassy Chassis company was brought back by a couple, and it existed for a few years. And that was the later version of Sassy Chassis, was when they made the USA 1 DXS, those incredible DXS chassis and suspension kits for the USA 1, and those things were absolutely just amazing. And unfortunately I never got one. I just didn't have the money. I was strongly considering it though back in the day. But this chassis here was made by the second version of Sassy Chassis. So originally they made these, the first version of Sassy Chassis made these 6-wheel drive aluminum tub chassis in all sorts of different anodized colors. There was gold and red and blue and black. And when the second version of Sassy Chassis came around, they only offered this in black, the chassis in black. So that's what this is here. This is from the second version of Sassy Chassis. And I bought it brand new from the company, and I bought it when I was starting to build up this truck. The wheels on this truck are JPS Circles machined aluminum wheels. All 6 of them are the same. And the tires are stock Tamiya bullhead tires with Sassy Chassis foam inserts inside of them. And I chose these wheels because they look just like the Alcoa aluminum wheels that are used on full-size semi-trucks. So I just absolutely love the way these wheels look. On the front, this truck has front wheel steering only, and all of the axle tubes, gear cases, and steering knuckles are from JPS. And I bought these aluminum JPS parts back when JPS was still in business, but I purchased them from RC Four-Wheel Drive. And back in those days, RC Four-Wheel Drive sold aluminum parts from different manufacturers, and they were more of a parts distribution company. So they sold JPS and other monster truck parts, but they did not make their own parts. Not quite at that time anyway. They did soon, quickly, and of course JPS is now a huge manufacturer of complete truck kits, but back in those days they were mostly a distributor for different companies' parts, and one of the companies they sold was JPS. So I bought all of the parts, all the JPS parts on this truck came from RC Four-Wheel Drive. The front steering belt crank is from ESP. This is one of their second generation versions of that steering belt crank, which is supported on ball bearings inside here. So it rotates nice and smoothly with no play. All the bumpers, front and rear, are ESP dual tube lower bumpers, and the skid plates, front and rear, are also ESP skid plates. All of the steering linkage is from ESP, and this Chernobog was built back in the days when ESP was still in business. The front and rear bumper brackets right here, these black plastic ones, are the stock bumper brackets from Clodbuster Metallic Special Edition, and I found those on eBay. Somebody was selling those brand new separately from the whole kit. And those are a recent addition. Actually, if you see any older photos of Chernobog, like from the old RCMT message board, I used to post a lot of photos of it as I was building it back in those days. If you see any pictures of it back then, you notice that the bumper brackets were the stock yellow bullhead ones, and I always hated those. I'm just not a big fan of the stock yellow color of those plastic parts on the bullhead, and it just drove me nuts for years and years until I found these black ones up for sale on eBay about a year ago. And so yeah, I'm still working on this truck. I'm still making truck changes to it after all these decades. Believe it or not, this truck seems like it will never be done. So as I'll tell you, there's some other parts I recently changed on this truck in addition to these black bumper brackets. So if you ever want to date some photos of Chernobog that you may have seen from back in the day, if it has the yellow stock bumper brackets on it, that's from back when it was first built. And if you see any pictures of it with the black bumper brackets like this, those are recent ones within the past year or so. The shocks, there are 3 of them per wheel, so for a grand total of 18 shock absorbers. And the shocks are Team Losi shocks, the rear shocks from the Triple XT Stadium truck. The shock mounts on the top are machined aluminum ones from Hamad Guman, another company that's like JPS, no longer in business. The motors inside, there's 3 of them. These are Trinity Speed Gem 2 Sapphire motors, which are 17-turn singles. The purple motor heat sinks are from Trinity. And all 3 of these motors are wired together in series. And that's because this truck has a Novak Super Rooster electronic speed controller inside, and a Super Rooster cannot handle 3 modified motors connected to it in parallel. And at that time, I don't know of any electronic speed controller with reverse that could handle 3 modified motors connected in parallel. So that's why I had to do these in series, which yes, cuts down on speed, but Chernobog is definitely not a land speed record holder by any stretch of the imagination. This truck is designed for low speed, power, just low speed stuff, and the only way to avoid that would be to put 3 speed controllers, 1 for each motor in this truck, and I just didn't have the budget for that at the time. I still don't to this day, so it has still the 3 motors wired together in series. All of the wiring is Dean's wet noodle 12 gauge wire, and all of the connectors on the motors and on the batteries are Dean's Ultra plugs. And right here in the stock holes in the chassis where normally you mount the parallel and series wiring switch right here for power and economy on a stock bullhead. That switch now controls the fan. There's an ESP cooling fan on the Novak Super Rooster. I'll turn it on. Right there. Powered by 6 onboard AA batteries. And the on-off switch right here, which normally controls the radio system, the power to the radio system of a stock bullhead, that switch now controls all the lights. So let me turn it on. So the headlights and the fog lights on the bumper there. So all of those are controlled by this switch right here. And those lights are the Tamiya headlight kit with the incandescent light bulbs in it. And I like that kit because they fit perfectly inside of the holes in the headlight buckets and on the front bumper. They come with nice, show right here, come with these nice aluminum mounting plates that hold the light bulbs in there nice and securely. The rear also has 3 shocks per wheel. And as I mentioned before, this truck has front wheel only steering. So it has the turning radius approximately of a city bus. It does not turn sharp at all. And the reason for that is because I originally built Chernobog to be a pulling truck. That was my intention anyway. And I could never find a pull sled back in those days for a reasonable price. They were not widely available. They were only made by these real small specialty shops, and they were just so expensive. So I kind of abandoned that plan. But as a result of me trying to make this, or originally planning to make this a pulling truck, it only has front wheel steering, and on the rear it has non-steering JPS aluminum axle tubes. So there's no steering knuckles here, if you notice. It just has a straight axle tube straight all the way to the wheel. And inside of those axle tubes are Sassy Chassis one-piece steel pulling axles. And I bought those originally from Tower Hobbies way back when I had my first, when I bought my first Tamiya Clodbuster back in 1987. So Tower Hobbies, back in those days, in addition to selling all the parts and kits made by or owned by Great Plains like Kyosho, they also, in the very back of the catalog, used to sell parts made by all sorts of different other manufacturers too. And some of the manufacturers that they sold were kind of small companies too, including ESP, which is where I bought my Clodzilla 4 kit that my Gravedigger truck has on it now. And they also used to sell parts from Sassy Chassis, the original version of Sassy Chassis from the late 1980s. And that's where I bought these axle shafts from, inside the axle tubes right here in the rear. And I originally bought those for my first Clodbuster because if you look at the back of those old Tower Hobbies catalogs, there were no descriptions for the parts that were in those old black and white part listings in the back of the catalog. They were just kind of like a phone book where they had the manufacturer and then the part numbers and then the price. There was absolutely no description of the parts whatsoever, so you didn't know what they were for. And when I saw those Clodbuster axle shafts in the Sassy Chassis section, I thought that they were just the little steering stub axles for a stock Clodbuster. I thought maybe they were a little bit thicker, maybe made out of stronger steel than the stock Tamiya ones. So I bought 2 pairs of them with the intent that I could put them on my Clodbuster back in 1987. But as I found out when they were delivered, I thought, oh, these are definitely not the stub axles, and they're not for a steering setup. So I just kind of left them in a box and just kind of threw them in my closet for decades until I built this truck. And then I finally had a use for those Sassy Chassis axles, and that's finally when I use them. So once again, being a pack rat pays off again. So if anybody out there has old parts and stuff like that, you never know when you may use them. So it took a good 15 or 20 years for me to use those axle shafts on a project, but here, finally, I had a project to use them on. So, and they fit and they work great. One of the things you'll also notice on these rear axles is that there are no ball joints machined into them right here in the axle tubes. Right here, none of them have that. Also, this intermediate axle here, the middle axle, no ball joints on that one. And also, if you look at the front steering knuckles, right in this area right here, there's no ball joint machined into these. And that is an example of dealing with JPS. And JPS is no longer in business, but one of the things that absolutely drove me bananas when dealing with JPS back in the day and their parts is that their parts are beautiful, they're gorgeous, and I still love them to this day and take a look at them, they look beautiful. But one of the things that absolutely drove me nuts is that JPS used to make little design changes to their parts without telling anybody about it. They didn't tell their customers, their website, when they had a website, did not have any mention of these little changes. Their catalogs made no mention of them. And most importantly, their part numbers for their parts stayed the same even after they made changes to them. So it was very confusing, and a lot of times you didn't know what you were getting until the package was delivered at your door, and that was the case here. I would have preferred to have the ball joints machined into my axle tubes on this truck, both front and rear, because that would have given me the option to use the stock style Tamiya bullhead ladder bar suspension system. But because those ball joints are not machined into these axle tubes, using the stock style ladder bars was an impossibility. They just would not fit on properly onto these axles. So that's an example of JPS just doing whatever they want to do and letting their customers figure it out and try to work it all out in the end. And that's kind of, in a nutshell, dealing with JPS parts. They were absolutely gorgeous and they're beautiful. They were not cheap, but sometimes they were a real hassle to get to work properly. I'll be perfectly honest. They were very difficult to work with many times. Now for Chernobog, and Chernobog has a 4-link suspension system. These are ESP suspension links here, all on all 3 axles. Those are all made by ESP, and those are the shorter ESP suspension links that were designed for stock bullhead wheelbase trucks. But thankfully, I was always going to use a 4-link suspension system on this truck, so the lack of the ball joints wasn't a real deal killer for me, but it would have been nice to at least have the option to use the stock Tamiya style ladder bars, but those are absolutely impossible to put on this truck. But because I was going to use a 4-link suspension on this truck anyways, I went ahead and when I was building the truck, I bought these ESP link and shock mount brackets for all 3 axles. And these, something as simple as these shock mount brackets, once again, JPS made it unnecessarily difficult because the rear ones, I don't know if you can tell on camera, these rear shock brackets are a little bit thinner than the ones here on the front. So these ones on the front are the exact same dimensions as the shock mount brackets that are on my Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger truck, but for some reason the rear ones were made a little bit thinner, and I don't know why. I think it's an example of, once again, JPS making design changes to their parts and not letting anybody know about it. But the thin ones on this truck are on both of the rear axles. So here's a thin one here, and here's a thin one here. So I have 4 thinner ones and 2 normal thick ones. So I put all 4 of the thinner ones on the rear axle so at least they match. But once again, that's JPS. JPS always made life unnecessarily a little bit difficult for people that like to use their parts. So on the rear of this truck, there is an ESP twin tube lower bumper, just like on the front, and also an ESP lower skid plate right here, just like on the front. And on the rear of the truck is a trailer hitch ball, and that is just like on Raging Bull. That is a pivot ball from a stock bullhead suspension system. And this truck also has the Novak rear brake lights, just like Raging Bull. And I mounted them here on the side, just like with the Raging Bull, because that's the way brake lights are mounted on full-size big rigs. They just kind of stick them on the frame, either on the top or on the bottom of the frame rails like that. So not too aerodynamic, but that's the way they do it on the real things. Now the back of Chernobog I wanted it to look kind of like a full-scale big rig. So that's why it's just kind of an empty black frame back here. And this, to cover up the Sassy Chassis tub frame, I made this polycarbonate cover here, just made out of thin polycarbonate that I bought at the local hardware store. So only cost a few bucks, and then I just painted it black. And I bolted it down with 10 stainless steel socket head cap screws. So that those holes, all 10 of those mounting holes, were already there on the Sassy Chassis aluminum tub chassis there. So I just used all 10 screws. And no, it doesn't need that many screws to hold it in place. They look cool because they're nice and shiny. So I decided to put all 10 in there, but it only needs about maybe 4 screws really to hold it in place. And yes, it is a pain because the batteries, the AA batteries that power the lights and the electronic speed controller cooling fan, all those batteries are located under here, under this cover, and it's a pain to have to change those because I got to remove all 10 of these socket head cap screws just to pop out the batteries. So it's a pain, but anyway, it looks cool with all those stainless steel screws on the top there like that. So that is my 6-wheel drive Tamiya Bullhead monster truck that I call Chernabog. And I will be showing what it looks like with the body removed, so I can show you what's inside the chassis. So stay tuned for that video. And oh, before I go, one thing I forgot to show is the steering servo. And Chernabog has the steering servo mounted in the stock location in the middle of the chassis right here, because as I said in my other videos, I've never liked the look of mounting a big giant boxy servo in front of the axle right here. And so it's here in the middle of the chassis, and that is a Surus CS80 steering servo, and that's one of those servos that has the clear plastic case on it that you can see through. And that's the same servos that I used on my Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger truck. And this servo saver right there is a Kimbrough large servo saver. And the servo is mounted on an aluminum servo mount made by Pargu. And that was one of the other modifications that I made recently. When I first built Chernabog, it had a stock plastic Tamiya Bullhead servo mount, and that always drove me nuts, and I always wanted to replace it, but nobody made a nice aluminum one back in the day. So just recently, over the past year or so, I found out that the Pargu makes a really nice one. So I ordered one and put it on there, and that's another example of where Chernabog just never changes. It just keeps evolving, and I keep replacing parts, and yes, spending more money on this truck. I do not want to even imagine how much I have spent on this truck through the decades, but it seems like this truck will never be done. So this is what it looks like right now, but who knows? In a few months, this truck may look totally different, or I may make more little changes here and there, but so far this is what Chernabog looks like, and it is definitely not the most exciting truck to drive as far as speed goes. It's very slow. I always tell people it has 3 speeds: slow, slower, and slowest. So it's definitely, with 3 motors connected in series, yeah, it's not too fast. And with a truck like this, I've always been afraid of rolling it over anyway, so I don't want to roll it over and destroy the beautiful paint job on it. And I always have my Clodzilla 4 Gravedigger truck to thrash on, so that truck is, whenever I need to have high-speed fun, that's the truck that I take out, but I never thrash on this truck. It's just too precious to me. But so anyway, that is my 6-wheel drive Tamiya Bullhead truck that I call Chernabog. So if you have any questions or comments about this truck, please feel free to leave them below, and please stay tuned for another video that shows just the chassis with the body and the rear cover removed. So I'll catch you in the next video.